Please consider subscribing. Welcome. Come one, come all. This is a cPDH deck tech for Syr Konrad, the Rat King. This one will be a little different than the ones previously presented and probably presented thereafter. Syr Konrad gives you the opportunity to discuss some theory crafting when it comes to deck building and preferences and what have you. So I wanted to take that opportunity to cover those bases, let you get into the madness of the mind of me, and kind of see what my perspective was when I started building this. So let's go back to the beginning. So Battle Frog was the original progenitor of this deck. It was a casual PDH deck that he brought into a cPDH pod a few years ago now. And it was Tatiova, Konrad, and two other cPDH decks, most likely combo control decks. And essentially, Konrad won. And the meme, as it were, at the time was that Konrad was undefeated by Tatiova. Undefeated by Tatiova. And it was kind of fun to play into that. But then, you have people asking over time, so here's the evolution of the thing, right? So people over time going, hey, is Konrad cPDH viable? And the first a couple of answers were, well, it's a meme, yada, yada, yada. Then after a while, you start to kind of think about it and look at it. And I'm going to reach out to Battle Frog. I'm gonna see what this list is all about. He was playing about 50 creatures, so 50% creatures, and I didn't understand why at the time, but then I later come to understand why. And he was just using it as this mid-range beatdown deck, and that's how you win, is you kind of grind out value via attrition, blah blah blah, gaining incremental damage with Konrad over time. That was my first goal, was to build a mid-range Konrad project. So my original non-rats list had 38 creatures in it. And this is where it gets fun. So creatures make Konrad's ability function, happen. So you need to be able to move creatures from zones, right? So in looking at Battle Frog's list, I'm going to throw some words around, but it's not really fair. So it's you have more optimal choices and less optimal choices with regard to Konrad's ability. And I'll give you an example. Viscera Dragger is the perfect Syr Konrad card, and I'll tell you why. Viscera Dragger, forget the mana cost, I'll put it up on the screen. But for 2 mana, you can cycle it. So with Konrad on the battlefield, you can change zones from your hand to the graveyard, triggering Konrad. Then, at a later time, you can unearth the Dragger and go from your graveyard to the battlefield, changing zones again. So in one card, you have multiple Syr Konrad triggers. My goal was to cut some of the chaff because Battle Frog was playing in, like I said, in a more casual meta, which is basically flooding the board with creatures, not much on permission or control or that sort of thing. So it made sense for them to have half and half creatures, half non-creatures. But for us, from a cPDH perspective, we want to have some level of interaction. So it actually started out more. The ultimate list ended up with only 8 pieces of interaction, but I'll get to that part later. When building my Konrad, I had 38 value creatures all trying to measure up the same standard as Viscera Dragger, and I'll post my original mid-range list in the description below. And essentially what I was trying to do was, I still had all the tech in there, discard creatures, the sacrifice creatures, because Konrad wants you to change zones with creature cards. I was doing all the classic stuff, the Forever Young type style effects, where you take any number of creature cards, put them on top of your library, change zones, Forever Young is a bad example because from a cPDH perspective, you want instant speed. That's something else that we'll cover a little bit later. I was basically trying to get the best quality creatures in black that I could at the time, and I had 38 of them. I was doing my best to maximize how much I was changing zones with Konrad and the associated spells. The problem that I ran into, and this is a problem that has been coming up a lot in cPDH, is the creatures that provide the best abilities, e.g. drawing a card or whatever, ETB type abilities or static abilities or whatever, right? The majority of those cards that do those things the best do not really close out games very well. So you got this 1/1 creature that ETBs and draws a card. Great, but 1/1, that's a 30 turn clock, right? The struggle that I was having with the original mid-range list was that, and the fact that I had all of these creatures that were getting value on their own, and I needed, so here's the part B, right? I needed Konrad on the board to be able to get value from those creatures, right? Changing zones. And on their own, they weren't doing enough. I set the deck down for a while because in my gold fishing, I wasn't doing much. And at the time, and this was a while ago now because I've been working on Konrad for a while. At the time, we were going from it's laughable now. We were going from a 15 to 20 turn late game clock, and we were kind of getting down into that, starting to touch on that 12 turn clock for gameplay. And I started thinking to myself, I was like, these creatures, these value creatures aren't going to get me there. And then no amount of protection, e.g. death denied, none of those types of protection creatures are going to save me from counter spells, all that stuff. So I needed another plan. And it was about this time that myself, and I'm gonna give a shout out to my rat buddy Steve in server. I don't remember exactly how it came up, but I saw a rat call in it, and I was like, this is it. I picked the deck back up after a couple of months, and it's probably like 2 months, and I started experimenting with the number of rats available. Now, if you remember, the original mid-range list had 38 creatures in it. The list that I resourced originally had 50 creatures in it. I'm like, okay, how many rats can I get away with at a bare minimum? Now, if you remember, Rat Colony on the screen, if you remember, what Rat Colony does is it gets a boost from every other rat, even crypt rats, every other rat on the battlefield on your side that you control. I started playing with numbers. I eventually settled originally on 28, plus, let's see, if the current list now has 39 total creatures in it. If you remember, there's a package of creatures that allow for the changing of zones. Those I'm conceptually in the deck, as far as function, I treat as spells. I mean, sure, they can get in for chip damage and that sort of thing, but by and large, some of those, like the sacrifice outlets, I'm not attacking with because I'm protecting those because oubliette is a thing. Of the 9 spells, the 9 creatures that make up those discard and sacrifice outlets, I'm basically treating those as spells. So the original deck that I came up with had 29 rat colonies. Over time, that ended up adding 2 more. Now we're at 30 rat colonies, and that's just a gas issue. What I was doing is Syr Konrad is probably the deck I've run the most data on for gold fishing and hands purposes. It's actually linked in the primer, all of my sample hands and my statistics and that sort of thing. Basically, I was trying to figure out the minimum number of lands I needed to run to be able to have 6 or so mana by turn 8. So turn 8 was the turning point. I wanted to look at how much damage I could put out, which is why the original list had 28 rats, final list has 30. So all the calculations were done off of the 28 rat colony number. Okay, so let's dig in the data real quick. And all of this is linked in the primer at the very bottom. So with 35 lands, this is some generic stuff that you can use for building out your cPDH decks. It's kind of what I would consider my go-to initial strategy for figuring out what resources I need in a deck. With this deck here, because the original mid-range list that I created had mana creatures in it, I decided to try to figure out what a rat colony list would look like without any dedicated artifact or creature ramp in the deck. The test was with 35 lands and the assumption of going from turns 1 through 8, drawing cards, playing cards, etc. I wanted to see what the data would give me, and I think I had 50 games, 50 hands, either 30 hands or 50 hands. I think it was 50 hands. And the range of values for lands experienced in your opening hand was anywhere from 2 lands in hand to 6 lands in hand. So 6 being the upper range, it's probably an anomaly. If we go back and look through the data, that's probably an anomaly that happened only a small percentage of times. Basically, you're just going to ship that away and mulligan into something else. What's important to note is the range begins with 2. Rat colonies being 2 mana. The minimum amount of lands found or experienced in your opening hand is also 2. What that tells me is that at 35 lands with 0 ramp mana creatures, you're going to have a minimum of 2. That means your opening hands are going to be better. If our opening hands are better, just from a mana-based perspective, then that means our ability to mulligan and make those better hands great. See where I'm going with this? That was kind of the data focused on the lands. If the lands in opening hand data, so the lands experienced in the opening hand off of your first 7 was 2 to 6, the range of values for lands being put into play over the first 8 turns was 4 to 8. In the first 8 turns, you had a minimum of 4 lands or a maximum of 8 lands, so one land per turn. It's not bad. I mean, 4 is not great, but also I would contend that just like 6 in the previous example, if you go through and look at the number of 4s experienced, it's less likely. And in fact, I did some mode calculations for this as well. I believe the mode of lands so the value most experienced in the however many iterations was 6. 8 turns, 6 lands. That's not bad for an aggro deck, right? Looking at the lands, now moving into the creatures. So remember the original list had 29 rat colonies in it. And the range of values for creatures, the number of creatures, so this would be all creatures to include the support creatures. So this would be out of 38 creatures, was 0 to 4. So you would either have 0 creatures in hand, ranging all the way through to either 4, up to 4 in hand. Now the range of values for the number of creatures in play between over the first 8 turns was 4 to 8. So you were playing. Now, this wasn't counting Konrad. In my recollection, because it's been a while since I ran this data, but in my recollection, I made it a point not really to cast Konrad until later in the game, say turn 7, turn 8. What that means is those first 6 turns, by and large, are all aggro. And in those first 6 turns being all aggro, we were experiencing 4 to 8 creatures into play over the first 8 turns. The reason why rat colonies are favored over any other available creatures in black for Syr Konrad comes down to 2 data points. In the data, unmitigated or unblocked lethal combat damage for 2 players occurred 94% of the time between turns 6 and 8. I'll say it again. Unmitigated or unblocked. So that means if there were no other creatures. Now I recognize that other creatures complicate things, but I can't run data on blocking of, the blocking of creatures that I don't know the data or stats of or what have you. I'm trying to find the outside end because let's say it like this. If the unmitted or unblocked lethal combat damage for 2 players, 2, not 1, 2, occurs 94% of the time in turns 6 through 8, then we can assume that we're probably going to kill one player with rats damage in that same amount of time. If this is telling me that 94% of the time, unblocked, I can kill 2 players, then what's the degree of likelihood that I'll kill 1 player in the same amount of time? What compounds that is for 3 players, I can kill unmitigated damage, combat damage. I can kill 3 players 30% of the time. So 3 players 30% of the time, turns 6 through 8. 2 players 94% of the time, turns 6 through 8. So what's it for 1? Well, there's nothing greater than 100%. I mean, even though we play around with numbers like 200%, what have you. But just kind of throwing out some gists there on the reasons why Syr Konrad the Rat King is better as a rat colony deck versus value creatures or even relentless rats, because we're talking a curve or we're talking relentless rats. Okay, the support spells. There is high debate. So Grave Purge on the screen. Grave Purge is the only to the top of library card that I play in this deck when there's like 3 or 4 others, and I'll tell you why. And this is the primary reason why. There's other side reasons, but the primary reason why I only play one of these types of effects is because if I take 3, and the target really is 3 to 4 rats, right? Not 20, not whatever, because that just compounds it and makes it worse, right? The problem makes the problem worse. The problem is if I take any number of creatures out of my graveyard and I put them on top of my deck, what does that tell my opponents? That tells my opponents that if I don't have an answer to their combo in hand, I'm not going to have it for 4 turns. That's pretty significant. And most people don't think about these cards in that context. So if I am having a really good aggro game and I got 20 rats in the yard, it's like, man. Now, if I have Konrad out and I'm putting 20 back, that's a different story. If I'm putting 20 back, then I'm moving 20 between zones and I'm getting 20 triggers, yada, yada. That's a good thing. But we want this deck to function in the absence of Konrad. If that's a good thing, how often is having Konrad on the board and having a good game where we have 10 to 20 creatures in the graveyard and we're casting this one spell that finishes everyone off, how likely is that going to happen? It can happen, and it probably will happen at some point in time. I've never had it happen yet. Grave Purge, I remember specifically only returning 4 creatures to the top of the library, and this was my thought process. Grave Purge says draw a card. Whatever the number is that you put on top of your library, it's going to be 1 short automatically because it has draw a card. I had a Sign in Blood in hand, so that's 2 more. So that left 1 rat on top. So basically I got a 4 creature trigger for Konrad, and then Sign in Blood, draw 2, deployed those 2, and then the next turn drew 1 rat and had 1 rat ready to go. And that is probably the optimal way to play Grave Purge. Now, if Grave Purge is the worst of those effects, then things like Echoing Return, Death Denied, all that stuff is infinitely better. It's easy to ascertain why, because they don't go back to the top of your library, complicating your future draws. They go to your hand, and if you don't have a discard outlet, at the minimum, at the end of turn, whatever excess you have in your hand, I'm gonna ditch them to end of turn discard cleanup step, and then I'm gonna take advantage of that with Konrad's ability. Right, having them in hand is infinitely better than having them on the top of your library. I'm hopeful that other people will experience the same thing the same conclusion I've come to after playing this deck for a while. That's the explanation for the recursion package that's in there. There's 2 rituals in there. They're in there for 2 purposes. One is supporting a huge Death Denied, so that way I can generate mana based on the number of creatures in the graveyard and then return all those creatures to my hand. Or I'm going to trigger Konrad's ability, which costs 2, and try to get value off that way. So that's what That's what the 2 rituals are for. That's why they're the big mana rituals and not Dark Ritual or Cabal Ritual, what have you. And I think that's it. Oh, Belden's Cane. Belden's Cane is an interesting choice because I can deploy it turn 1, and while artifact removal exists in the format, it's not as prolific. So I can basically deploy a Konrad finisher early game, and it sits there waiting for the moment. If somebody tries to remove my Felden's Cane, you basically pop it in response, and you won't get as much value as you were intending to get, but you have a player shifting their priorities to take care of this cane that's sitting on. So it's a win either way. That's it. At the request of the DDB selection committee, the other folks who reviewed this list, I included a greedy version of this list in the primer. What greedy means is no interaction. It's all gas. Like you're just doing your thing, sans what anybody else is thinking. You're drawing cards and you're playing rats, and you're drawing cards and you're playing rats. You're casting Konrad. You're doing graveyard things. That's what greedy is. It's sans interaction. Thank you for coming to and watching my extended version of a Syr Konrad the Rat King deck tech. I hope it's helpful. We'll see you on the flip side.